In this video, we are going to follow a single, ordinary day inside a medieval monastery kitchen, not as a backdrop to larger events, but as a complete system in its own right, where bread is baked in a stone oven, pottage is kept alive on the hearth, water is carried from a well by hand, and an entire community is fed through routine rather than haste. Everything you hear is drawn from historical practice, based on how monastic kitchens actually functioned, from the way ovens were fired and sealed, to how food was stored, reused, and served in silence, without modern tools or measurements. We will move slowly through this process from morning to evening, beginning before the fire is lit and ending after the kitchen has been cleaned and set in order for the next day, paying attention to the small decisions that made survival reliable rather than dramatic. There is nothing here you need to remember and nothing you need to wait for, because the value of this kind of history is not in a single moment, but in how many small actions fit together when they are repeated over years. If you stay awake, you will learn how medieval kitchens actually worked, and if you fall asleep, the work will continue quietly without you, just as it once did. So you can listen closely, or let the details pass by at their own pace, as we step into a day shaped entirely by habit, restraint, and the slow, dependable logic of a monastery kitchen. Before any fire is built, before grain is handled or water carried, the monastery kitchen already exists in a state of readiness, because in a place governed by repetition rather than urgency, the day does not begin with action, but with continuity. The building itself is quiet, not because it has been abandoned overnight, but because nothing here requires announcement, and the absence of noise is simply the result of work having ended properly the night before. Stone walls hold the cold of early morning, thick enough to resist the warmth of the coming day, and the floor beneath is hard and worn smooth by decades of steady use, bearing no marks of decoration, only the shallow evidence of feet passing the same routes again and again. Light enters slowly through high openings, angled not to illuminate fully, but to make shapes legible, enough to move without stumbling and to see what must be done without inviting distraction. Nothing is touched at first. This pause is not ceremonial, but practical, allowing the mind to settle before decisions are made, because errors made early tend to multiply as the day continues. The hearth sits cold, its ash undisturbed from the night before, embers buried beneath a thin layer of gray that preserved what little heat remained, a deliberate choice made hours earlier with this moment in mind. Nearby, tools rest exactly where they were returned: wooden paddles, knives, buckets, and cloths, arranged not for symmetry, but for recall, so that the hand reaches for what it needs without conscious search. In a monastery kitchen, order is not enforced through instruction, but through familiarity, because familiarity shortens work and preserves energy across long seasons. The monks arrive without gathering, entering individually and quietly, their presence marked not by conversation but by motion, each person taking up a task that has already been decided by habit rather than assignment. No one asks what will be cooked, because that was determined long before the morning arrived, by the stores available, the calendar observed, and the labor expected later in the day. This kitchen does not plan creatively. It plans conservatively. Before fire is introduced, the space is checked, not with inspection, but with recognition, noting what remains, what was left intentionally, and what will need attention before the day is finished. The oven stands sealed from the previous firing, its thick walls retaining the faint memory of heat, a promise that bread can be baked later without rebuilding warmth from nothing. The well buckets are stacked neatly, rope coiled loosely rather than tightly, preserving the fibers for another day of strain, because failure here would halt everything else that follows. Cloths hang where air can reach them, dried but not cleaned again, ready to serve the same purpose they served yesterday, because in this kitchen, reuse is not neglect, but discipline. Only when the space has been quietly acknowledged does the day move forward, and the first active task is chosen not for importance, but for sequence, because sequence determines efficiency far more reliably than effort. The fire will come soon enough. So will water, grain, and heat. For now, the kitchen holds still, complete in its readiness, waiting only for the first small decision that will set everything else in motion. Once the kitchen has settled into readiness and the day has been quietly acknowledged, attention turns toward the oven, not because bread is urgent, but because bread requires the longest patience and the least interruption, and so it must be addressed before the smaller, more flexible tasks begin. The oven itself is a fixed structure, built of stone and clay and shaped into a shallow dome, its form chosen not for appearance, but because this shape gathers and returns heat evenly, allowing bread to bake without direct flame once the fire has been withdrawn. Before any dough is handled, the oven must be fired, and this process begins slowly, with thin, dry wood placed inside and ignited carefully, not to create a large blaze, but to warm the stone gradually and prevent cracking that would weaken the structure over time. The fire is allowed to build in stages, small additions of fuel feeding it steadily rather than all at once, because the goal is not brightness or speed, but saturation, heat pushed deep into the oven walls where it can be stored and released later without further effort. There is no thermometer and no marker to signal readiness, and so the monks rely on signs learned through repetition, the color of the interior stone, the way ash settles, the feel of heat at the oven mouth, all of which together indicate when the fire has done its work. When the oven is judged ready, the fire is not extinguished abruptly, but drawn forward with wooden tools and removed carefully, embers set aside rather than discarded, because even after baking they will serve another purpose. Ash is brushed across the oven floor lightly, not cleaned away entirely, creating a thin, insulating layer that moderates heat and prevents loaves from scorching where they touch the stone. Only now does the oven wait, sealed briefly to allow heat to settle and equalize, a pause that matters as much as any action, because uneven heat ruins bread quietly and without warning. While the oven stabilizes, the dough is brought forward, having rested overnight in cool air, fermented slowly rather than forced, its surface marked by small bubbles that indicate readiness more reliably than any measure of time. The loaves are shaped with minimal handling, divided according to need rather than uniformity, each portion reflecting not a recipe, but the number of mouths that will later be fed. Scoring is done simply, shallow cuts made with a plain blade, not for decoration, but to control how the bread expands once heat reaches it, preventing uncontrolled cracking that would dry the loaf too quickly. There is no delay once this work is finished, because dough left waiting loses strength, and so the oven door is opened only briefly, loaves slid inside with a long wooden peel, arranged with care and speed so that heat is not lost through hesitation. Each loaf is placed directly on the stone floor, with space between them to allow air and heat to circulate, and no trays or barriers are used, because simplicity here preserves both heat and reliability. Once the last loaf is loaded, the oven is sealed immediately, not checked again, not adjusted, because opening it wastes heat that cannot be replaced without repeating the entire firing process. From this point on, the bread must be trusted to the oven, and attention shifts away, because baking here is not a matter of control, but of preparation, and everything that could be done has already been done. Time is estimated loosely, not measured precisely, judged by experience and by What else must be accomplished while the oven works quietly on its own? The monks do not hover, because hovering serves no purpose, and instead return to the hearth, the pantry, and the well, allowing the oven to release its stored heat at its own pace. When the bread is finally removed later in the day, it will bear the marks of this process: darkened crust, uneven shape, and a texture shaped by stone, heat, and patience rather than precision. For now, the oven remains closed, its work underway, forming the foundation of the meal long before it is seen or tasted. With the bread sealed inside the oven and the fire reduced to a steady, patient heat, the kitchen's attention naturally shifts away from flame and motion and toward the quieter work that determines whether the coming days will pass smoothly or collapse into unnecessary strain. In a medieval monastery, the pantry is not a single room, and it is never treated as storage in the modern sense, but rather as a carefully distributed system of spaces, habits, and limits designed to ensure that nothing useful disappears before it has served its full purpose. The first of these spaces is cool by design, built with thick stone walls and narrow openings that allow just enough light to see without allowing warmth to linger, because heat shortens the life of stored food long before it makes itself obvious. Here, sacks of grain are stacked on low wooden pallets rather than directly on the floor, not for convenience or order, but because stone draws moisture upward, and grain that rests against it will soften, mold, and fail long before it is needed. There are no markings on the sacks, no written labels or dates, because the monks rely instead on memory, weight, smell, and touch, all of which are more reliable in a space where literacy is limited and habits remain unchanged year after year. Most of what is stored here is barley, rye, and oats, grains that grow reliably in poor soil and cold climates, chosen not for taste but for survival, while wheat, when present at all, is treated as a reserve rather than a staple. Older sacks are kept forward and used first, not because of formal rules, but because rotation has become instinctive, reinforced by the quiet understanding that grain forgotten at the back will eventually become grain wasted. Nearby, dried peas and beans sit in wooden bins, having already been cooked once before, drying, because uncooked legumes demand too much fuel and time to prepare safely, and nothing in this kitchen is allowed to consume more resources than it returns. Salt is stored separately, sealed carefully against damp, and handled with restraint because it preserves meat, flavors food, and prevents sickness, and its loss is felt slowly but deeply across an entire season. Along the beams overhead hang bundles of dried herbs, tied months earlier and left to cure slowly in moving air, their leaves curled inward and aromatic, kept not as decoration but as seasoning, medicine, and a memory of the garden when it was green. Sage, thyme, lovage, and mint are chosen not for luxury but for function, easing digestion, calming the stomach, or masking the thinness of meals that cannot afford indulgence. This knowledge is never formalized and rarely spoken aloud, passed instead through repetition, observation, and quiet correction when mistakes are made. Further along, the scent of the pantry shifts subtly, carrying smoke and earth, signaling the storage of fuel, where firewood is stacked by thickness and dryness, thin kindling kept separate from heavier logs. Because starting a fire and sustaining one are different tasks that require different materials. Each piece of wood represents heat, cooked food, clean water, and light. And so it is counted not in numbers, but in days, with careless use today quietly borrowing hunger from tomorrow. Charcoal is kept apart, wrapped in cloth to contain ash, reserved for tasks that require steady, controlled heat, and used sparingly because producing it costs fuel that cannot be recovered. Even ash itself is collected and sorted rather than discarded, destined for cleaning, soil treatment, or lye making, reinforcing the understanding that waste is not defined by use, but by neglect. Along one wall sit clay jars sealed with cloth and wax, holding rendered animal fat or butter when it is available, substances that carry warmth and energy and can transform thin food into sustenance with a single spoonful. These jars are opened briefly and checked often, judged by scent and texture, because spoiled fat is dangerous, and no container here is trusted, simply because it was trusted yesterday. Root vegetables are stored low and dark, onions and turnips kept cool to slow decay, with softer ones used immediately and firmer ones saved, because spoilage is expected and managed rather than lamented. Nothing in these rooms is arranged for beauty, and nothing is stored for display, because the pantry exists to remove uncertainty from the future, not to impress the present. When the inspection is complete, the doors are closed, not locked, because order here depends on habit rather than enforcement, and the monks return to the kitchen knowing exactly what they have, what they lack, and how long the balance will hold. The oven continues its work unseen, the hearth remains steady, and the stores wait quietly, doing exactly what they were meant to do. While the bread bakes unseen within the sealed oven and the kitchen settles into a quieter rhythm, the hearth remains active, not with sudden motion or attention, but with a kind of steady watchfulness that governs the most reliable meal the monastery produces. Pottage is already hanging over the fire, suspended in a heavy iron pot that has not been fully emptied in days, because in a medieval monastery kitchen, pottage is not understood as a dish that begins and ends, but as a process that continues, reinforced gradually rather than replaced. Each morning, water is added to the pot, not measured by volume or quantity, but judged by color, thickness, and the way the surface moves when stirred, all cues that become familiar through repetition rather than instruction. Too much water thins the mixture and reduces its ability to sustain those who eat it, while too little allows the grain to scorch and stick, wasting fuel and effort, and so the balance is maintained through attention rather than calculation. The base of the pottage is grain, most often barley or oats, sometimes rye, chosen for their durability and availability rather than flavor, and soaked overnight before cooking, because soaking softens husks and shortens the time the pot must spend over active heat. What was soaked the day before becomes the foundation of the present meal, carrying forward the labor already invested rather than demanding it again. Stirring is done slowly and deliberately, with a long wooden paddle that scrapes the bottom of the pot just enough to lift the grain before it can catch, a motion repeated at intervals throughout the day rather than constantly, because constant stirring wastes attention that is needed elsewhere. Responsibility for the pot is shared, with different hands returning to it between other tasks, ensuring that no single person bears the burden of watchfulness and that mistakes are caught before they become losses. Vegetables are added gradually, beginning with onions, which soften early and lend depth without spice, followed by turnips, leeks, or cabbage sliced thin so they cook evenly and disappear into the mixture rather than standing apart. Nothing enters the pot whole, because large pieces require more fuel and time to soften, and efficiency here is valued more than appearance. Protein, when present at all, arrives in modest form, most often dried peas or beans that have already been cooked once and rehydrated, because raw legumes demand more heat than the kitchen can afford on most days. Fat is introduced cautiously, if available, in the form of a small spoon of rendered animal fat or butter, melted slowly into the pottage to carry calories rather than flavor, because even a small amount changes how filling the meal becomes. Salt is added late and lightly, not withheld entirely but never used freely, because salt dulls the senses when overused and shortens supplies when wasted. Dried herbs from the pantry are crushed between fingers and added sparingly, chosen not for luxury but for their effect on digestion and the body, easing the strain of simple, repetitive food over long seasons. As the day progresses, the pottage thickens slowly, water evaporating while starches swell, and the texture changes not abruptly but gradually, allowing adjustments to be made without urgency. This gradual thickening is precisely why the pot is never emptied completely, because what remains at the end of the day becomes the base for tomorrow, enriched by time rather than expense. In the evening, the pottage is served again, thicker than at midday, more sustaining, and the remaining portion is thinned slightly with fresh water before being moved farther from the fire, kept warm but not boiling through the night. Cold is avoided, because repeated cooling invites spoilage, while constant boiling wastes fuel, and so the pot rests in a carefully chosen balance between the two. The hearth itself is managed with equal restraint, fuel added in small amounts rather than large bursts, allowing a steady heat to persist without flare or waste, while ash is pushed inward to insulate embers rather than removed entirely. No clock governs this process, and no signal marks completion, because the work is guided by observation, memory, and the accumulated knowledge of those who have done it before. When night settles and the kitchen quiets, the pot remains, unchanged in purpose and ready to serve again, holding within it not only food, but the careful discipline that allows a community to endure. With the hearth settled and the pottage maintained at a steady warmth, attention in the monastery kitchen turns to the quiet labor that underlies every other task, because without water, nothing else in the day can proceed for long. In a medieval monastery, water is never assumed to be present, and it is never treated as background, because it does not arrive on demand and it does not replenish itself without effort. The well is positioned outside the main kitchen structure, separated deliberately to reduce damp and contamination, its stone lining worn smooth by generations of hands that have lowered and raised buckets along the same narrow opening day after day. A heavy wooden beam spans the top of the well, supporting a thick rope whose fibers are polished where palms grip it most often, and the bucket itself, made of wood bound with iron, is already heavy before a single drop of water touches it. Lowering the bucket is done slowly, not out of caution, but because speed damages rope, and a frayed rope here is not an inconvenience but a serious risk, capable of ending a day's work in an instant. The sound of the bucket matters, the hollow echo marking empty depth, followed eventually by the dull splash that signals water has been reached, a cue learned early and remembered without effort. Drawing the bucket back up requires the whole body, arms close, back straight, movement practiced to conserve strength, because water is heavy in ways that are not obvious until it must be carried repeatedly across uneven ground. Spilled water is not punished, but it is noticed, because every lost drop must be replaced, and replacement always costs time, energy, and daylight. The path from well to kitchen is worn into the ground, stone, polished, smooth where feet have passed for decades, mud hardened by repetition, and in winter this path becomes treacherous, while in summer it turns dry and dusty, but it is always walked with care. Buckets are never carried directly to the hearth, because cold water meeting hot metal too quickly weakens vessels, and so the water is first set down, allowed to settle, and then transferred into smaller containers suited to specific tasks. Pitchers are reserved for cooking, basins for washing, clay jars for storage, and none of these uses are confused, because mixing them risks contamination that may not be noticed until sickness appears. Clean water is always claimed first for food preparation, because a meal ruined by poor water wastes far more than the water itself. Only after cooking needs are met does water move to washing hands, which is done sparingly and at specific moments, before kneading dough, before serving food, and after handling waste, rather than continuously, because constant washing would exhaust supplies without improving safety. Water used once is reused deliberately, wash water becoming cleaning water, and cleaning water later finding its way to the floor or the yard, because no water is discarded while it still has work to do. For drinking, water is rarely taken raw, instead being boiled or diluted with weak ale, not out of preference, but because experience has shown that untreated water carries illness even when it appears clear. The monks do not debate this practice or attempt to explain it. They simply follow habit, which, in this case, preserves health more reliably than understanding ever could. Dishwashing water is warmed lightly, never brought to a boil, and ash is added in small amounts to create a mild lye solution, enough to loosen residue without damaging wood or skin, a balance learned through repetition rather than measurement. As the day progresses, the remaining water is assessed repeatedly, not counted, but judged by sight and weight, determining whether another trip to the well will be required before nightfall. If sufficient water remains, it is covered and kept cool overnight, protected from dust and insects, while if it does not, the next morning will begin, once again, at the well. The act of carrying water shapes the entire rhythm of the kitchen, limiting excess, slowing decisions, and forcing every task to acknowledge the cost of what it consumes. As evening approaches, buckets are stacked, ropes are coiled loosely rather than tightly, to preserve their fibers, and the well is covered, not locked, simply closed, because protection here relies on habit rather than force. When the kitchen finally settles, water has been moved, used, reused, and respected, and the quiet order of the day holds, ready to begin again without correction. After the meal has been served and the bowls have returned to the kitchen, the work does not end in any obvious way, because in a monastery kitchen, the conclusion of eating simply marks the transition into the final phase of the day's labor, one that determines whether the next morning will begin smoothly or be burdened by small, accumulated failures. The bowls themselves are heavy wooden vessels, shaped thick to endure years of use, and they are never treated casually, because wood remembers every mistake made with water, swelling, cracking, and weakening in ways that cannot be reversed once they appear. For this reason, cleaning begins without water at all, each bowl wiped carefully while food residue remains soft, using designated cloths or straw that have long since passed any other purpose, because removing debris mechanically first preserves both the vessel and the limited supply of clean water. Only after the surface has been cleared does water enter the process, drawn earlier from the well and warmed gently at the hearth, never heated for comfort and never brought to a boil, because fuel is spent here only to prevent rot and sickness, not to achieve cleanliness in the modern sense. Into this warm water is mixed a small amount of sifted ash, strained until fine, creating a mild lye solution whose strength is judged by touch rather than measure, because too strong a mixture damages wood and skin, while too weak a one wastes effort without effect. The monks learn this balance slowly, through repetition and correction, and once learned it is rarely discussed, becoming simply another quiet competence carried forward from day to day. The washing itself is brief and efficient, with no soaking and no scrubbing, each bowl rinsed quickly and dried immediately with cloth before moisture can settle into the grain of the wood, then placed upside down on open shelves where air can move freely and mold cannot take hold. Metal tools are addressed next, knives, ladles, and the long wooden stirring paddle, wiped clean before rinsing, and wiped again afterward, because iron rusts silently and spreads damage faster than most other forms of neglect in a working kitchen. The great pot that hangs over the hearth is always left until last, and even then it is never fully cleaned, only scraped gently along the interior to remove excess while leaving behind a thin, dark coating that protects the metal and carries the accumulated depth of previous days' cooking. This residue is not considered dirt, but protection, and removing it entirely would shorten the life of the pot and weaken the continuity of the food it produces. Once returned to its hook, the pot is allowed to cool slowly, never shocked with cold water, because sudden changes in temperature cause cracks that cannot be repaired and would force the loss of one of the kitchen's most valuable tools. Attention then turns to the hearth itself, where ash is pushed inward to insulate embers rather than removed entirely, while excess ash is collected and saved for future use in cleaning, soil treatment, or lye making, reinforcing the understanding that nothing here is truly waste until it has served every possible function. The floor is swept in slow, consistent strokes toward the door, using bundled twigs rather than water whenever possible, because moisture trapped in stone invites rot and cold that linger long after the surface appears dry. Spills are addressed first with straw and cloth, and only if residue remains is water introduced, following the same order used throughout the kitchen: dry before wet, simple before costly. Tables and benches are wiped and cleared, not for appearance, but so that every tool returns to the same place it occupied the day before, allowing the space to be navigated without conscious effort, which is essential in a kitchen where fatigue is constant and mistakes compound quietly. As the work draws to a close, the remaining water is assessed once more, reused where possible, and carried outside to be discarded well away from the building and the well, poured where it will soak harmlessly into the ground rather than pool and stagnate. Basins are inverted to dry, cloths are wrung out and hung where air can reach them, and nothing is left damp overnight if it can be avoided, because dampness invites sickness in ways that are rarely noticed until they have already taken hold. When the kitchen finally settles, it looks much as it did before the day began, unpolished and unremarkable, but ready, which is the only measure that matters in a place where tomorrow depends entirely on how quietly and thoroughly today has been closed. Order here is not displayed or admired, but felt in the absence of problems, in the way the next morning begins without correction, delay, or waste. As the kitchen settles into its final readiness and the hearth holds a controlled, patient warmth, the work shifts once more, not toward preparation or cleaning, but toward the act that gives meaning to everything that came before, the feeding of the community itself. In a medieval monastery, food is never served casually, because every meal reflects not only the labor invested in it, but the discipline that governs the house, and so the transition from kitchen to refectory follows a rhythm that has been repeated so often it no longer requires instruction. The refectory is a long, plain room, its walls bare or lightly adorned, its benches fixed in place, designed not for comfort or conversation, but for order, and as the monks enter, they do so quietly, taking their places according to rank and seniority without discussion or correction. Silence governs the room, not as punishment, but as structure, because speaking distracts from both eating and listening, and meals here are meant to nourish the body while leaving the mind undisturbed. At the head of the room, a single reader stands, assigned for the day, prepared to recite from scripture or approved texts, his voice steady and unhurried, carrying words that fill the space where conversation might otherwise settle. Serving begins without announcement. Bowls carried from the kitchen in measured numbers, placed carefully rather than passed, because spilling food wastes more than sustenance. It wastes labor, that cannot be recovered. Pottage is ladled consistently, not generously and not sparingly. Because portions are determined not by appetite but by calculation, each serving shaped by the knowledge of how many mouths must be fed and how long the stores must last. No one chooses more, and no one asks for less, because the meal is not an expression of preference, but a shared agreement that what is provided is sufficient. Bread is distributed alongside the bowls, each loaf broken rather than sliced, its unevenness accepted without comment, because uniformity is less important than fairness, and the bread has already served its purpose simply by existing. The monks eat slowly, not out of ceremony, but because haste dulls the senses and encourages waste, and the rhythm of the reader's voice naturally sets a pace that keeps the meal unhurried and contained. No one watches another's bowl, and no one compares portions, because comparison breeds dissatisfaction, and dissatisfaction spreads more quickly than hunger in a communal setting. Second servings, when allowed, follow a fixed order, beginning with those whose labor has been heaviest, a system understood without explanation, because hierarchy here is functional rather than symbolic. Water or weak ale is poured sparingly, never refilled without pause, because liquid is as carefully managed as food, and excess here would ripple backward into the work of the well and the hearth. When the meal concludes, there is no signal beyond the reader's final words, and the monks rise together, bowls left in place, the room clearing as quietly as it filled, because efficiency here prevents confusion and unnecessary movement. Any remaining food is accounted for immediately, not celebrated or lamented, but redirected, thickened pottage reserved, bread saved if still sound, nothing discarded until its usefulness is truly exhausted. The refectory empties, returning to stillness, while the kitchen receives the used vessels without interruption, continuing the cycle that began hours earlier with water, grain, and fire. Feeding the community is never treated as an event, because events draw attention to themselves, and attention is a resource better spent elsewhere, on consistency, restraint, and the quiet assurance that everyone has been sustained. By the time the day fully settles, the meal has already faded into routine memory, leaving behind no excitement and no tension, only the steady knowledge that the system is held once again. As the refectory empties and the last movement of the day fades back into the kitchen, the work does not stop so much as narrow, because evening in a monastery kitchen is less about doing new things and more about closing every open loop that the day has created. The first attention returns to the hearth, where the fire that has worked steadily since morning is now reduced with care, not extinguished completely, because heat here is not wasted if it can be preserved for the morning. Larger pieces of fuel are allowed to burn down naturally, while smaller embers are pushed inward and covered with a measured layer of ash, thick enough to slow oxygen, thin enough to keep warmth alive beneath the surface. This is not done quickly, because ash placed carelessly smothers embers too completely, while ash placed too lightly allows heat to escape into the stone overnight, leaving nothing to recover in the morning. The monks judge this balance by habit rather than rule, adjusting by sight and memory, because the hearth behaves differently in winter than in summer, and stone remembers cold longer than flame. Once the fire is banked, attention shifts to food that remains, not as leftovers in the modern sense, but as material that must be stabilized, protected, and folded back into tomorrow's work. The pot of pottage is moved farther from direct heat and thinned slightly with clean water if needed, ensuring it will cool slowly without crossing into the temperature range where spoilage is most likely. It is never sealed tightly, because trapped heat invites souring, and it is never left fully exposed, because insects and dust travel quietly at night. Bread, once cooled, is stacked carefully, loaves separated enough to allow air to move between them, cloth placed loosely over the top rather than wrapped, because trapped moisture ruins bread faster than hunger ever could. Any loaf that has cracked or baked unevenly is set aside first for the next day's use, not discarded, because priority here is determined by fragility, not preference. The pantry doors are checked again, not opened fully, but acknowledged, confirming that nothing damp, warm, or exposed has been introduced unintentionally during the day. Fuel stores are assessed quietly, noting how much wood has been consumed and how long the remaining supply must stretch, not written down, but remembered, because the body recalls scarcity more reliably than numbers. Water vessels are covered, ropes inspected briefly for wear, and buckets stacked in a way that keeps them from trapping moisture overnight, because rot begins invisibly and spreads without sound. Cloths used throughout the day are checked once more, rehung if still damp, repositioned if air cannot reach them, because leaving something unfinished here means beginning tomorrow already behind. The floor is given a final sweep, not to clean, but to reset, removing anything that might be crushed underfoot in the dark or carried unknowingly into the next day's work. Tools are returned to their places deliberately, not out of neatness, but so that morning begins without search, hesitation, or correction, because the first moments of the day shape everything that follows. There is no final inspection and no spoken conclusion, because the absence of problems is the only confirmation required that the work has been done properly. As the kitchen darkens and the building settles back into stillness, nothing here appears remarkable. But every system is in place, every process paused rather than ended, and the day closes without urgency or excess. The fire rests, the food waits, the space holds. Tomorrow will begin not with repair, but with continuation, which is the quiet success of a monastery kitchen when it has been run well. Although the structure of the monastery kitchen never changes, the year reshapes it slowly and persistently, because stone, water, and fire behave differently as the seasons turn, and the work must adapt without ever becoming hurried or uncertain. In winter, the kitchen holds cold long after night has passed, the stone walls storing it deeply, so that even after the hearth is lit, warmth gathers reluctantly, forcing every decision about fire to be made with greater patience and foresight. Fire loads increase, not dramatically, but consistently, with thicker logs chosen earlier in the day and embers banked more carefully at night, because restarting a cold hearth in winter consumes far more fuel than preserving even a trace of warmth beneath ash. The oven, too, requires longer firing, its walls reluctant to absorb heat, and so bread days are planned with more margin, allowing extra time for stone to warm fully before loaves are ever considered ready to bake. In these months, the oven mouth is opened less frequently, not out of caution, but necessity, because heat escapes faster into cold air, and every opening subtracts from what cannot easily be replaced. Water becomes heavier work as well, not in weight, but in resistance, ropes stiffening, buckets numbing the hands, and in the deepest cold, ice forming along the well's edge, requiring careful breaking before the bucket can be lowered at all. Water drawn in winter is often warmed sooner and used more deliberately, because cold water chills dough, slows fermentation, and stiffens hands already strained by the season. Pottage thickens more quickly in winter, evaporation slowing while starches continue to swell, and so more frequent thinning is required to keep the pot from becoming dense and difficult to serve. Bread fermentation stretches longer as well, the dough rising slowly in cold air, sometimes resting closer to the hearth, not to force speed, but to keep the process moving without spoilage. In summer, the kitchen behaves very differently, stone releasing cold reluctantly and holding warmth far longer than desired, so that even small fires raise the temperature of the space more quickly than intended. Fire loads are reduced, kindling favored over thick logs, and embers spread more widely rather than banked, because excess heat lingers and turns the kitchen into a place of fatigue rather than work. The oven heats faster in warm months, sometimes too fast, requiring careful monitoring so that bread does not scorch before the interior has time to set. Baking windows shift earlier in the day, before heat builds fully in the stone and air, allowing loaves to finish while the oven is still predictable rather than aggressive. Water, though easier to draw, demands greater vigilance in summer because warmth invites spoilage, insects, and souring, and vessels must be covered more carefully and emptied more frequently. Pottage is thinned more often, served slightly lighter, and moved farther from the hearth during the day, because constant warmth that preserves in winter can spoil in summer if left unchecked. Herbs are used differently as well, fresher when available, dried more cautiously, and rotated faster, because oils turn quickly in heat and bitterness replaces usefulness without warning. Insects appear in summer, where they vanish in winter, forcing food to be covered loosely but consistently, and scraps to be removed promptly rather than held for later use. Despite these changes, the underlying order of the kitchen never shifts, because routines remain intact even as details adjust, proving that the system works not because it resists change, but because it accommodates it quietly. Fire is still banked at night. Water is still carried by hand. Bread is still trusted to stone and time. Winter slows the work and demands endurance. Summer accelerates it and demands restraint. Across both, the kitchen remains what it always is, a place shaped less by the calendar than by attention, memory, and the steady acceptance of limits. After enough days have passed, the kitchen no longer feels divided into mornings and evenings, nor into baking days and non-baking days, because repetition smooths the edges between them until time itself becomes less a sequence and more a surface that is walked across steadily. What distinguishes one week from another is rarely a single event, but the quiet accumulation of the same actions performed again, with small adjustments that no one announces and no one records, because the system does not rely on conscious memory to function. The hands remember where the tools rest even when the mind does not, and the body reaches for the bucket, the paddle, the oven peel, without instruction, because repetition has replaced recall. In this way, the kitchen becomes a place where thinking is minimized, not through carelessness, but through mastery, as the work has been reduced to movements that no longer require deliberation. The order of tasks remains stable across weeks, even as individuals age, change roles, or disappear entirely, because the system itself persists independently of any one person's attention. Bread is mixed because it is always mixed. Pottage is stirred because it is always stirred. Water is carried because it must be, and because it always has been. Over years, this repetition alters perception, compressing time so that seasons feel shorter and individual days lose definition, while the kitchen itself feels unchanged, as though it exists outside the calendar altogether. Tools wear gradually, their surfaces smoothed not by intention but by thousands of identical grips, and this wear becomes a form of record, more reliable than writing, because it cannot exaggerate or forget. The floor remembers footpaths even when those who walk them are gone, stones worn slightly hollow where bodies have turned again and again at the same points in the room. Recipes, if they can be called that, are not stored as fixed instructions but as ranges, understood intuitively, adjusted daily, and passed forward through observation rather than explanation. No one needs to be told how thick the pottage should be, because it has been seen too thin and too thick enough times that the correct state announces itself without words. When someone new enters the kitchen, they learn not through lectures, but by absorbing the rhythm, watching when others move, when they wait, and when they intervene, until the work begins to guide them without correction. Errors still occur, but they are absorbed by the system rather than punished, because redundancy, shared responsibility, and gradual pacing prevent any single mistake from carrying lasting weight. Over long spans, the kitchen becomes less a place of production and more a stabilizing force, a structure that persists even as beliefs, leadership, and external pressures shift beyond its walls. Years pass, and no one can recall the first time they performed a task, because beginnings lose relevance once continuity takes over. What remains is not memory in the personal sense, but operational memory, embedded in layout, routine, and habit, ensuring that the work continues even when individuals are tired, distracted, or replaced. This is how the days blur, not into meaninglessness, but into reliability, where nothing feels urgent, yet nothing is neglected. The kitchen does not ask to be remembered. It asks only to be repeated. In the monastery kitchen, silence is not the absence of sound, but the absence of unnecessary speech, because the work itself produces enough noise to orient everyone without explanation. The scrape of a wooden paddle against the bottom of a pot carries more information than a sentence ever could, telling those nearby whether the pottage is thickening too quickly or settling into the correct slow resistance. Footsteps across stone do not echo randomly, but fall into familiar patterns, heavier near the hearth, lighter near the water vessels, slowing instinctively in places where heat or spill has made the floor unreliable. The oven announces its readiness not with sight alone, but with sound, as the fire's roar softens and the crackle of fuel subsides, signaling that heat has soaked fully into the stone. Buckets set down near the well-mouth land with a dull, rounded impact when full, and a sharper hollow sound when empty, making weight audible without inspection. These sounds repeat daily, layering over one another until they become a background structure, like breath or heartbeat, noticed only when something interrupts the pattern. When someone moves too quickly, the kitchen reveals it immediately through noise. A clatter of tools, a splash too loud, a lid dropped rather than placed, each sound gently correcting behavior without reprimand. Silence between these sounds is not filled intentionally, because conversation would compete with signals the body already understands. This restraint is not imposed harshly, but learned gradually, as workers discover that quiet allows attention to stretch outward, catching small changes before they require correction. Over time, the kitchen becomes legible through sound alone, allowing tasks to overlap smoothly, each person adjusting their pace to what they hear rather than what they are told. In this way, the work carries itself forward, guided by rhythm rather than instruction, by repetition rather than command. The silence is not empty. It is occupied fully by the work continuing exactly as it should. Over weeks and years, the tools of the monastery kitchen change so gradually that the change is rarely noticed in any single moment, because nothing here is replaced quickly, and nothing is discarded simply for being imperfect. Wooden paddles thin slightly along their edges, not evenly, but where the same hand has pressed again and again while stirring pottage at the same angle, producing a subtle curve that no craftsman would intentionally design, yet which fits the motion of the arm perfectly. Knife handles darken where oils from the skin settle into the grain, and this darkening becomes a map of use, marking where fingers rest, where pressure is applied, and where balance naturally falls during repetitive cutting. Cracks form in bowls and buckets long before they fail, and these cracks are watched quietly, tested each day by habit rather than inspection, until the object announces on its own that it can no longer be trusted with weight or heat. When something does fail, it is rarely dramatic. because the kitchen expects decay and plans for it through redundancy, using multiple vessels, multiple tools, and overlapping methods so that no single break halts the work. Repair is constant, but uncelebrated, performed during pauses rather than set aside as its own task. A loose handle tightened while water heats, a cracked rim wrapped and bound before the next use. Nothing is repaired to look new, because appearance carries no authority here, only function, and the value of a tool is measured by whether it continues to behave predictably under familiar strain. This gradual adaptation allows tools to evolve alongside the people who use them, shifting shape just enough to reduce effort without requiring conscious adjustment. The oven itself participates in this slow change, its interior stones smoothing where loaves slide repeatedly, its mouth widening imperceptibly as ash and heat wear away sharp edges that once caught sleeves or knuckles. Cracks in the masonry are not feared immediately, but monitored through seasons, patched when necessary, because the oven's memory is longer than any individual baker's, and its behavior is understood through continuity rather than theory. By relying on wear instead of redesign, the kitchen avoids disruption, allowing each generation to inherit tools already shaped for use rather than instruction. A new worker does not need to be told how hard to grip or where to stand, because the objects themselves guide movement, having been worn into forms that reward correct handling and resist haste. In this way, the tools become teachers, transmitting knowledge silently across years, preserving technique without words, manuals, or conscious memory. Nothing here strives for permanence, yet everything endures, because replacement is slower than repair, and repair is slower than habit. The kitchen does not freeze time. It allows time to pass without demanding attention. In the monastery kitchen, survival is not managed through counting or calculation in the modern sense, but through an accumulated understanding of volume, weight, and duration that lives in the body rather than on paper, shaped by repetition and corrected slowly over years rather than days. Grain is not measured by exact units, but by containers whose sizes are known intimately, baskets that feel right when lifted, sacks that are judged by how they settle against the hip when carried, and bins whose levels are read by eye, with an accuracy born from familiarity rather than precision. No one needs to announce how much remains, because everyone passing through the pantry absorbs the same information unconsciously, noticing the height of grain against the wall, the number of loaves left cooling on boards, the thickness of the pottage as it is replenished rather than emptied. Surplus is not celebrated, because excess creates its own problems, attracting pests, increasing spoilage, and demanding additional labor to protect it, so the goal is always continuity rather than abundance. The pantry is arranged to make scarcity visible early, not hidden, so that adjustments can be made gradually, thinning portions slightly, stretching meals across days, or shifting emphasis toward ingredients that store more reliably. Root vegetables are placed lower, where cool air settles, while dried grains are lifted away from damp stone, their containers rotated slowly so that older stores are used first without formal record. Herbs hang in bundles not for decoration, but for airflow, their placement calculated through experience to prevent mold while keeping them close enough to the hearth to remain dry through changing seasons. Nothing here is forgotten because nothing is hidden, and visibility replaces memory as the primary management tool. The rhythm of use reinforces this system, as daily withdrawal from storage naturally reveals imbalance long before it becomes crisis, allowing correction to happen quietly, without alarm. When grain runs lower than expected, the kitchen responds not with urgency, but with restraint, reducing waste, tightening reuse, and leaning more heavily on foods that require less fuel or preparation. This adaptability is built into the system, not imposed externally. because the monastery kitchen was never designed to operate at peak output, only at sustainable output. Over years, this creates a kind of living equation where inputs and outputs remain in balance, not because they are calculated exactly, but because deviation is felt physically through effort, hunger, or delay. The kitchen learns to anticipate winter months not through dates, but through the weight of sacks, the dryness of wood, and the way air moves through the pantry when doors are opened at dawn. Mistakes do occur, but they rarely compound, because storage is distributed across multiple forms: grains, roots, preserved broths, and bread cycles, ensuring that failure in one area does not collapse the whole. This redundancy allows calm to persist even under pressure, because no single misjudgment determines the outcome of the season. Over time, those working in the kitchen no longer think in terms of days remaining, but in terms of flow, trusting that if the system is maintained, tomorrow will resemble today closely enough to function. Food is not treated as a series of meals, but as a continuous process, always moving, always changing form, always returning to usefulness through attention rather than intervention. In this way, the monastery kitchen survives, not through planning for extremes, but through maintaining steadiness, allowing small corrections to replace dramatic solutions. Nothing here aims for comfort in the modern sense, yet the absence of panic becomes its own form of security. The kitchen does not promise abundance. It promises continuity, and then quietly keeps it. In the monastery kitchen, work is never hurried, not because there is little to do, but because urgency introduces error, waste, and exhaustion that the system cannot afford to correct repeatedly. Every task is paced deliberately below the threshold where haste would seem useful, allowing the body to operate for hours without strain, and ensuring that attention remains diffuse rather than narrowly focused on completion. Bread dough is not kneaded quickly, because rapid force overheats the mixture and tires the arms prematurely, so pressure is applied slowly, rhythmically, with pauses that allow both the dough and the worker to settle into cooperation rather than resistance. Water is not carried at maximum capacity, even when strength allows it, because spills cost more energy to clean than the extra trip costs to make, and uneven loads invite injury that removes a worker from the system entirely. Fire is fed steadily rather than aggressively, because a fire built too fast demands constant correction, while a fire grown patiently holds its heat with less attention and less fuel. This avoidance of urgency is not laziness, but foresight, learned through generations who discovered that endurance matters more than output when work has no end point. Tasks overlap naturally, not to increase speed, but to reduce idle waiting, allowing one process to progress while another rests, keeping the entire kitchen in motion without any single action becoming dominant. The absence of clocks reinforces this pacing as work responds to readiness rather than schedule, with loaves loaded when the oven is right, pottage served when it has settled, and cleaning performed when heat has receded enough to make it safe. Mistakes caused by rushing are remembered longer than successes achieved quickly, and so the culture of the kitchen discourages speed through quiet example rather than instruction. Those who attempt to work faster than the rhythm allows quickly learn that the system resists them. Tools slip, liquids spill, fires flare unpredictably, and fatigue arrives early, undoing any apparent advantage. Over time, this teaches patience as a practical skill rather than a moral one, reinforcing that survival depends not on effort alone, but on its distribution across time. The kitchen thus becomes a place where energy is conserved as carefully as food, parceled out across hours and seasons to prevent collapse. Even during shortages or cold months, the pace rarely accelerates, because urgency under pressure leads to compounding failures that worsen the situation rather than improving it. Instead, Adjustments are made through reduction and simplification, fewer loaves, thinner pottage, shorter fires, maintaining rhythm even as volume decreases. This consistency creates a sense of steadiness that extends beyond the kitchen itself, anchoring the wider monastery in predictability when other aspects of life remain uncertain. Labor here is not optimized for speed. It is optimized for repetition without collapse. The work continues not because it is rushed, but because it is allowed to take exactly as long as it needs. In the monastery kitchen, heat is never treated as a background convenience, because every flame represents labor already spent and labor that must be spent again, making fuel one of the most carefully managed resources in the entire system. Firewood does not arrive magically at the hearth, but passes through a long chain of decisions that begin far from the kitchen itself, with trees selected, cut, split, dried, stacked, and guarded months or even years before they are burned. Each piece of wood carries a history of effort, and this history shapes how it is used, because no one wastes dry hardwood on tasks that can be accomplished with scraps, nor ignites a full fire when embers will suffice. The size of logs matters, not for speed, but for control, as thicker pieces are reserved for long, steady heat, while thinner branches are saved for quick ignition or brief warming that does not justify a larger burn. Ash is not discarded thoughtlessly, because it still contains value, sifted and reused for cleaning, insulation, or soil amendment, closing the loop between fuel and maintenance. The hearth itself is treated as a living structure, read daily through the behavior of flame and smoke, its drafts adjusted subtly by shifting stones, dampers, or fuel placement rather than through overt intervention. Those who work the fire learn to recognize the difference between heat that is active and heat that is stored, understanding that stone and iron continue to release warmth long after visible flame has faded. This awareness allows the kitchen to stagger tasks efficiently, baking bread immediately after peak firing, simmering pottage as heat declines, and performing cleaning or drying when only residual warmth remains. Fuel use is never isolated to a single task, but planned across the entire day, so that one fire supports multiple needs without being rekindled unnecessarily. In colder months, this planning becomes more pronounced, as fires are built slightly earlier, banked more carefully, and shielded from drafts that would steal heat faster than the wood can replace it. No one rushes to add fuel at the first sign of cooling, because premature feeding often creates uneven heat that wastes both wood and attention. Instead, the fire is allowed to settle, its temperature assessed by feel, sound, and the behavior of hanging vessels, reinforcing a sensory understanding of heat rather than a numerical one. Over years, this careful relationship with fire shapes behavior beyond the hearth, encouraging restraint, anticipation, and respect for processes that cannot be hurried without consequence. The kitchen learns to live within the limits of its fuel, adjusting menus, timing, and workload to match what heat can realistically provide rather than demanding more than the system can sustain. This discipline ensures that warmth is available when it matters most, not squandered when it feels convenient. Fire here is not an indulgence. It is a shared responsibility carried quietly from season to season. The hearth does not burn for spectacle. It burns so that everything else may continue. As daylight fades beyond the small openings of the monastery kitchen, the work does not end sharply, nor does it transition into rest through announcement or signal, but instead thins gradually, like embers settling into ash, until only what must be done remains. The final tasks of the day are chosen not for productivity, but for preservation, ensuring that what has been prepared continues safely into the next cycle without inviting spoilage, waste, or disorder. Pots are shifted away from direct heat and left to cool slowly, because rapid temperature changes risk cracking both vessel and contents, undoing hours of steady effort. Remaining loaves are arranged carefully, spaced to allow air to circulate, their crusts hardening into a protective shell that will keep them usable through the night and into the following day. Liquids are covered, not sealed, allowing steam to escape while preventing contamination, a balance learned through observation rather than instruction. Water vessels are topped off if needed, not to prepare for immediate use, but to ensure that morning work begins without delay, when energy is highest and fire must be lit quickly. Ash is gathered and spread thinly across the hearth floor, insulating remaining heat so that it may be coaxed back to life with minimal fuel at dawn. Tools are not scrubbed to cleanliness in the modern sense, but wiped, rinsed, and placed where they will dry evenly, preventing rot, rust, or warping overnight. The floor is swept not to remove every trace of the day, but to clear pathways, reduce pests, and make morning movement predictable even before light returns. As fewer hands remain, tasks are completed sequentially rather than in parallel, slowing the pace naturally and reinforcing the transition from labor to stillness. There is no final inspection, because the system itself reveals imbalance through sight and feel, and anything unfinished will present itself clearly when work resumes. The kitchen settles into a state of readiness rather than closure, prepared to resume without needing to be rebuilt mentally or physically. Outside, night air cools stone walls gradually, storing calm rather than cold, while inside, the faint warmth of the hearth lingers as a reminder of continuity. This ending is repeated daily, not as ritual, but as necessity, creating a sense of completion without finality. Nothing dramatic marks the moment when the kitchen becomes quiet. It simply arrives there, one small task at a time. The work does not stop because it is finished. It stops because it has been prepared to begin again. Nothing that happens inside the monastery kitchen begins inside the kitchen itself, because every loaf, every pot of pottage, and every vessel of water depends on decisions and labor performed days, weeks, and seasons earlier, often by people who will never step near the hearth. Grain arrives, already shaped by weather, soil, timing, and storage practices, and the kitchen's role is not to transform poor inputs into abundance, but to preserve what has already survived a long chain of vulnerability. Wheat, barley, and rye are received in forms that reflect local conditions rather than preference, meaning the kitchen adapts its processes to what the land provides, rather than enforcing a fixed menu across years. Grain is inspected not formally, but through handling, poured slowly from sack to bin so that sound, flow, and resistance reveal dampness, infestation, or broken kernels without requiring explicit sorting. Anything questionable is set aside immediately, not discarded outright, because even substandard grain may still serve secondary uses, thickening pottage, feeding animals, or stretching stores during lean weeks. Vegetables arrive unevenly, pulled from gardens at varying stages of maturity, and are accepted as they are rather than trimmed to uniformity, because consistency is less important than continuity. Roots are brushed rather than washed when possible, preserving their skins and extending storage life, while greens are used quickly, folded into meals the same day they are cut, before wilting can claim them. Herbs are gathered deliberately but sparingly, never stripped from a single plant, because regrowth matters more than immediate flavor, and the kitchen plans for months, not meals. Meat, when present at all, enters the kitchen already constrained by religious rules, preservation limitations, and availability, meaning its use is tightly controlled and distributed rather than celebrated. Fish arrives dried, salted, or smoked, often rigid and opaque, requiring soaking and gradual rehydration before it can be incorporated safely, a process that begins hours before cooking even becomes possible. Nothing arrives in excess packaging or measured units, so the kitchen develops a deep familiarity with shape, smell, weight, and texture as the primary tools of assessment. Deliveries do not follow strict schedules, and delays are expected rather than disruptive, so menus remain flexible, structured around substitution rather than reliance on specific items. This flexibility allows the kitchen to remain calm under uncertainty, because it never assumes ideal conditions, only workable ones. Over time, procurement becomes an invisible extension of cooking itself, with preparation beginning long before fire is lit and ending long after the meal is served. The kitchen does not wait for perfect ingredients. It works with what has endured the journey to reach it. What arrives is accepted. What endures is used. In the monastery kitchen, nothing is weighed in the modern sense, because scales are rare, fragile, and unnecessary when consistency is achieved through repetition rather than calculation, and so measurement lives in vessels, motions, and physical resistance instead of numbers. Grain is portioned using containers whose capacity is understood through years of handling, baskets that fill to the same depth each time, wooden scoops whose volume is confirmed not by markings but by how they sit in the hand when full. Flour is judged not by quantity alone, but by its behavior as it moves, poured slowly into troughs or bowls until its surface settles at a familiar angle, neither peaked nor flat, signaling a workable starting point without the need for adjustment. Water is added incrementally, not all at once, because the goal is not to hit a number, but to arrive at a texture that responds predictably under the hand, and this response is easier to sense when changes occur gradually. When mixing dough, the hands serve as the primary measuring tool, detecting moisture through resistance, elasticity, and temperature, adjusting pressure and hydration until the mass pulls away cleanly without tearing or sticking. This tactile feedback replaces written ratios entirely, allowing the same method to work across different grains, seasons, and humidity levels, where fixed measurements would fail repeatedly. Salt is added sparingly and deliberately, pinched between fingers rather than scooped, its quantity remembered through habit and reinforced by taste rather than record. In pottage, thickness is monitored continuously as ingredients soften and release starches, requiring frequent stirring not only to prevent scorching, but to read how the mixture evolves over time. The paddle's resistance becomes the gauge, heavy enough to indicate satiety, light enough to stretch across meals, adjusted subtly by adding water, broth, or leftover grains until balance is restored. Heat itself is measured indirectly through sound, smell, and the speed at which liquids begin to tremble before boiling, allowing cooks to moderate fire without visual indicators or instruments. Baking relies on timing felt through observation rather than minutes counted, with loaves assessed by color, aroma, and the hollow sound produced when struck lightly, each sign reinforcing the others. No single indicator is trusted alone, because accuracy emerges from overlap, not precision, and multiple sensory confirmations reduce the chance of error. Corrections are made early and gently, rather than late and forcefully, ensuring that deviations never grow large enough to disrupt the meal or exhaust the worker. This system rewards attentiveness rather than exactness, allowing different hands to achieve similar results without standardization, because the kitchen values repeatability over replication. Over time, the body internalizes these measurements so deeply that they no longer feel like decisions, but like responses, shaped automatically by context. Measurement here is not an act of counting, it is an act of noticing. Accuracy is not imposed. It emerges through familiarity that does not require thought. In the monastery kitchen, nothing is scheduled by hours or minutes, because mechanical timekeeping is either unavailable or irrelevant to work that responds to readiness rather than to an abstract division of the day, and so time is managed through sequence, dependency, and physical cues instead of numbers. The day begins not at a fixed moment, but when light reaches a familiar point on the wall, when the chill in the stone floor feels a certain way under bare or sandaled feet, and when the air carries the quiet stillness that allows fire to be lit without distraction. Tasks are arranged in an order that reflects necessity rather than preference, with actions that require the longest passive duration initiated first, so that waiting is absorbed naturally into other work rather than standing alone. Fire is built early because heat takes time to accumulate in stone, and nothing else can proceed properly until that heat has settled and stabilized, making ignition the anchor around which the rest of the day organizes itself. Water is drawn immediately afterward, not because it is urgent, but because carrying it early reduces interference later, when movement around the hearth increases and pathways narrow. Dough is mixed once the fire is established, but before the kitchen fills with activity, allowing it to rest and ferment while other tasks occupy attention, so that time passes productively without conscious waiting. Pottage begins simmering early as well, not because it must be eaten immediately, but because its slow transformation benefits from prolonged, low attention, requiring occasional stirring rather than constant oversight. These overlapping processes create a layered schedule in which no task exists in isolation, and no one action determines the pace of the whole, allowing flexibility without confusion. Rather than checking time, workers check progress, noting how dough responds to pressure, how pottage thickens against the paddle, and how heat radiates from stone surfaces when approached. When one process advances more quickly than expected, it is held gently rather than rushed forward, shifted to cooler areas, covered, or simply left undisturbed until other tasks catch up. Delays are absorbed just as easily because the system anticipates variation, relying on readiness cues instead of deadlines that would otherwise demand correction. Meals are served when preparation converges, not when a bell demands it, aligning nourishment with completion rather than enforcing completion through schedule. Cleanup follows naturally as heat declines, because tasks requiring less warmth wait until those requiring more are finished, conserving fuel and effort without formal planning. Even rest is scheduled indirectly, arriving when physical signals indicate diminishing returns rather than when an external marker allows it. Over weeks and years, this approach produces remarkable consistency, not because time is controlled tightly, but because dependency ensures that each task arrives when conditions support it best. The absence of clocks does not create disorder, it creates attentiveness. Work here unfolds not by counting moments, but by responding to what is ready to happen next. In the monastery kitchen, loss is not treated as an exception, because spoilage, breakage, and misjudgment are expected outcomes of working with organic materials, variable heat, and human endurance, and so the system is constructed not to eliminate failure, but to contain it before it spreads. Food is prepared in quantities that assume some portion will degrade before it is eaten, and this assumption shapes everything from portion size to storage placement, preventing optimism from creating scarcity later. Bread occasionally overbakes or underbakes, loaves cracking unevenly or setting too hard, but these loaves are not discarded immediately, instead dried further for reuse as thickeners, trenchers, or rations that extend utility beyond the original intention. Pottage sometimes scorches slightly at the bottom of the pot, especially when attention is divided, and rather than stirring aggressively and contaminating the whole vessel, the upper portion is transferred gently, leaving the damaged layer behind, is less than #0. 6# is greater than. This selective salvage prevents one small error from turning into a complete loss, preserving the bulk of the meal while accepting a controlled sacrifice. Vegetables soften unevenly or spoil at different rates, and those showing early signs of decline are used first, chopped finer, cooked longer, or incorporated into broths where texture matters less than sustenance. Nothing is thrown away simply because it is imperfect, but nothing is forced into use if it threatens the safety or continuity of the whole. Tools break, crack, or warp over time, and when they do, their failure is isolated rather than disruptive, because replacements are prepared slowly in advance or substituted temporarily without halting work. Fuel burns inconsistently, especially in damp conditions, and rather than compensating immediately with excess wood, fires are adjusted gradually, allowing inefficiency to be absorbed without panic. The kitchen plans for waste by distributing risk across multiple processes, ensuring that no single task carries all responsibility for nourishment on any given day. This distribution allows errors to remain local, contained within one pot, one batch, or one vessel, rather than cascading through the entire operation. Loss is documented not in writing, but in memory and behavior, shaping future decisions subtly rather than through explicit correction. If a method consistently produces waste, it is adjusted quietly, portions reduced, timing altered, or heat moderated, without formal acknowledgement of failure. This approach prevents shame from entering the system, keeping attention focused on continuity rather than blame. Over years, the kitchen develops resilience not by avoiding mistakes, but by becoming fluent in recovery, able to redirect efforts smoothly when outcomes fall short. Waste here is never dramatic. It is anticipated, limited, and repurposed whenever possible. Failure is not a collapse. It is a boundary the system already knows how to work around. In the monastery kitchen, continuity is never dependent on any single individual because people arrive, age, weaken, fall ill, or are reassigned, and the work is structured from the beginning to continue without pause as these changes occur. Roles exist, but they are not rigidly owned, and tasks are arranged so that knowledge is distributed across observation rather than instruction, allowing someone to step into a position gradually without disrupting the pace of the day. New hands learn first by proximity, standing close enough to absorb rhythm, watching when movements slow, when they stop, and when they resume, long before they are trusted with independent responsibility. This gradual absorption ensures that replacement never happens suddenly, because competence is accumulated quietly, layered over time until it becomes indistinguishable from experience. No task is designed to require specialized strength, speed, or rare skill, because dependency on exceptional ability introduces fragility into a system meant to endure across decades, is less than #0. 7# is greater than. Tools are chosen and maintained so they reward correct handling instinctively, guiding new users into proper technique without verbal correction. The layout of the kitchen itself serves as instruction, with paths worn into stone, storage arranged to reflect frequency of use, and heat zones clearly felt underfoot, directing movement naturally. When someone leaves the kitchen permanently, whether through reassignment or death, the work absorbs the absence immediately, because no process halts waiting for recognition of loss. Tasks redistribute quietly, portions adjusted slightly, pace reduced marginally, allowing the system to continue while a replacement grows into readiness. This elasticity prevents strain from concentrating in one place, protecting both the remaining workers and the quality of the food. Knowledge is preserved not in documents, but in routine, because written instruction cannot capture the subtle timing, resistance, and sequence that define effective work. Over time, individuals become interchangeable, not through uniformity, but through shared exposure to the same processes repeated until variation narrows naturally. Even leadership within the kitchen rotates without ceremony, as responsibility shifts to whoever currently holds the clearest view of the whole rather than the highest status. This prevents authority from becoming a bottleneck, ensuring decisions remain responsive to conditions rather than hierarchy. The kitchen thus becomes larger than the people who pass through it, preserving function without memory of origin. Those who work there leave behind no signatures, no records, and no personal marks beyond the where they contribute to tools and floors. And when they are gone, the kitchen continues, unchanged in appearance, unchanged in rhythm, because it was never designed to reflect the individual. Continuity here is not maintained through preservation of people. It is maintained through preservation of process. The work does not remember who performed it. It remembers only how to continue. In the monastery kitchen, cleaning is never treated as a final task reserved for the end of work, because disorder compounds quietly and becomes harder to correct the longer it is ignored. And so maintenance is folded continuously into every stage of production. Surfaces are wiped not to achieve visual cleanliness, but to remove residues that attract insects, promote spoilage, or interfere with predictable handling, meaning that attention is directed toward function rather than appearance. Water used for cleaning is never fresh without reason, because clean water carries labor with it, and so it is reused in descending order of purity, first for food preparation, then for vessels, then for floors, and finally discarded only when it can no longer serve safely. Wooden tools are scraped and rinsed while still warm, because dried residue adheres more strongly and invites mold, requiring greater effort later that disrupts the rhythm of the next day's work. Metal implements are dried immediately, not polished, because rust begins invisibly, and prevention costs less attention than repair. The hearth area is cleared gradually throughout the day, ash moved aside in thin layers rather than allowed to accumulate, preserving airflow and preventing heat from becoming unpredictable. Spills are addressed as soon as they occur, not because they are dangerous immediately, but because dried residue hardens paths into hazards, altering movement patterns and increasing fatigue. Floors are swept frequently but lightly, removing debris without stirring dust unnecessarily, keeping air clear and surfaces readable by foot even in low light. No one waits for permission to clean, because the responsibility is shared, and every worker understands that neglect shifts effort forward rather than eliminating it. This constant low-level maintenance prevents large cleanings from ever becoming necessary, allowing the kitchen to remain usable even under strain or shortage. Pest control emerges naturally from this practice, as crumbs, standing water, and warm refuse are removed before they can become invitations, rather than after they have become problems. Nothing here is sterilized in the modern sense, but everything is kept within tolerable bounds, preserving health through regular intervention rather than dramatic correction. Over time, the kitchen teaches that cleanliness is not an outcome, but a condition sustained through repeated small actions that never call attention to themselves. The absence of visible dirt is not the goal. The absence of future problems is. Cleaning does not follow work. It moves alongside it, quietly preventing what would otherwise interrupt tomorrow. In the monastery kitchen, light is treated as a finite resource that shapes what kind of work is possible at any given moment, because illumination arrives unevenly, changes constantly, and cannot be increased without cost, and so tasks are arranged to cooperate with visibility rather than struggle against it. Daylight enters through small openings placed high in thick walls, designed to preserve warmth and security rather than brightness, creating bands of usable light that move slowly across the room as the sun shifts. These moving patches of visibility become informal clocks, not marking hours, but signaling when certain kinds of work can be done safely, as cutting, sorting, and inspection depend more heavily on clear sight than stirring or carrying. Early in the day, when light is strongest and most direct, tasks requiring precision are prioritized. Grain is inspected, bread is shaped and scored, vegetables are trimmed, and vessels are checked for cracks that might be missed in shadow. As the sun lowers and contrast increases, the kitchen shifts naturally toward work, guided more by touch, sound, and routine. With pottage stirred by resistance, water carried by weight, and fire tended by heat felt rather than flame observed. Artificial light is available but limited, relying on candles, rushlights, or small oil lamps that produce uneven illumination and consume resources better saved for colder months or longer nights. Because of this, artificial light is used sparingly and purposefully, positioned close to the task rather than the space, illuminating hands and surfaces rather than attempting to brighten the entire room. Candles are placed where shadows fall predictably, avoiding glare near reflective surfaces like water or metal that would strain the eyes and slow movement. Wicks are trimmed frequently, not for brightness, but to reduce smoke and soot, which would accumulate quickly in enclosed spaces and interfere with breathing and cleanliness. The limited reach of light encourages stillness, as unnecessary movement increases the risk of collision, spillage, or injury, reinforcing the slow, deliberate pace already favored by the kitchen. Paths through the room are memorized by foot, not eye, worn into stone and reinforced through repetition, allowing workers to move confidently even when visibility drops below comfortable levels. Objects are returned to consistent locations after use, because searching in low light wastes time and increases noise, disrupting the quiet coordination of the space. As darkness approaches, work contracts rather than stops abruptly, tasks completed in smaller radius around the hearth where residual light and warmth remain longest. Cleaning is performed selectively, focusing on clearing hazards rather than achieving visual order, because cleanliness can be finished by daylight, but safety cannot wait. This gradual narrowing of activity ensures that no one is forced to choose between speed and safety, allowing the day to conclude without tension. In winter months, when daylight is brief, this compression becomes more pronounced, reinforcing the importance of preparation earlier in the day and restraint later on. The kitchen learns to work with diminishing visibility not by fighting it, but by accepting limitation as a planning factor rather than an obstacle. Light here does not extend the day. It defines its useful edges. Work continues not until it is finished, but until it can no longer be done safely or clearly. In the monastery kitchen, storage is not about isolating food from its surroundings, because airtight containment is rare and often harmful, but about placing materials where air, temperature, and time interact slowly enough to prevent rapid decay. Pantries are positioned deliberately, often against exterior walls or partially below ground, where stone moderates temperature fluctuations and keeps interiors cooler than the working kitchen without introducing dampness. Airflow is encouraged rather than blocked, with vents, slatted shelves, and open spacing, allowing air to move gently through the room, carrying moisture away before it can settle into grain, bread, or wood. Nothing is stacked tightly unless it benefits from compression, because trapped air invites mold, rot, and insects more reliably than exposure does. Bread is stored, elevated, placed on wooden racks or hung in cloth slings so that air can circulate around each loaf, allowing crusts to harden gradually and resist spoilage over days rather than hours. Grain bins are left uncovered or lightly shielded rather than sealed, because condensation forms quickly in closed vessels, undoing the benefit of dryness achieved during harvest and threshing. Roots and tubers are layered in straw or sand, not to hide them, but to buffer temperature and absorb excess moisture, slowing respiration and extending viability without refrigeration. Herbs hang loosely from beams or racks, spaced to prevent overlap, drying evenly as air moves past them, their placement adjusted seasonally to avoid direct heat or cold drafts. The storage room is entered frequently, not only to retrieve supplies, but to observe changes, checking surfaces, scent, and texture so that decline is detected early when response is still possible. No inventory is written because quantity is assessed visually and tactically, levels read by eye, fullness judged by sound and resistance when containers are shifted. Items nearing the end of their useful life are moved closer to the kitchen, not separated as waste, but prioritized for immediate use where heat and cooking can salvage value. The storage space itself is cleaned minimally, but regularly, swept to discourage pests, wiped to remove condensation, and kept orderly enough that airflow remains unobstructed. Strong smells are avoided because scent transfers easily in enclosed stone rooms, tainting foods that would otherwise remain usable. This restraint creates a storage environment that feels quiet and unchanged, even as contents cycle continuously through it. Over time, the pantry becomes less a room of holding and more a slow transition space, where ingredients move steadily from potential to use without interruption. Preservation here does not rely on stopping time. It relies on slowing it enough to remain manageable. Nothing is hidden from decay. It is simply given the conditions to arrive later rather than sooner. In the monastery kitchen, feeding a community is never approached as a single event, because a meal is only one moment in a longer chain of preparation, storage, and recovery, and so distribution is planned to preserve balance rather than to satisfy appetite alone. Portions are not calculated individually, because doing so would require constant adjustment and oversight, but instead emerge from vessels whose size has been shaped over time to match the expected number of mouths without excess. Ladles, bowls, and trenchers act as measuring devices, their capacity implicitly understood, allowing food to be divided evenly without counting or negotiation. Pottage is served at a consistency that supports this method, thick enough to carry sustenance, yet fluid enough to settle evenly into each bowl without variation, reducing the chance that early servings differ from later ones. Serving begins only once all vessels are ready, because staggered distribution introduces imbalance, while simultaneous serving ensures that no portion benefits from fresher heat or heavier settling. Those who serve do so from memory rather than instruction, repeating motions that have been refined through years of repetition, pouring to the same depth each time without looking closely. Corrections are subtle, a slight tilt of the ladle, a pause to allow liquid to drain, an adjustment made instinctively rather than announced, preventing disruption to the flow. Bread is divided not by slicing evenly, but by breaking loaves along natural fault lines in the crust, producing portions that appear irregular but average out across the meal. This method avoids the waste created by trimming and ensures that every piece remains usable, even if texture varies slightly from portion to portion. Distribution proceeds calmly, because haste causes spills and misallocation that cost more effort to correct than the time saved by moving quickly. Silence is often maintained during serving, not as ritual, but because conversation interferes with attention and increases the chance of uneven portions. Any remaining food is not treated as leftover in the modern sense, but as material already assigned to future meals, cooled carefully, and repositioned for reuse without additional handling. This continuity ensures that feeding never draws down reserves unexpectedly, allowing the kitchen to maintain stability across days rather than reacting meal by meal. Portions are designed to satisfy without surplus, because excess encourages complacency, while slight restraint ensures attentiveness to stores and preparation. No one leaves the meal uncertain whether there will be food tomorrow, because predictability matters more than fullness. The act of feeding becomes routine rather than celebratory, reinforcing that nourishment is a constant responsibility rather than an occasional event. Waste is minimized, not by strict control, but by aligning vessel size, food texture, and serving rhythm so closely that imbalance rarely has room to appear. The kitchen does not aim to impress those it feeds. It aims to finish the day with its system intact. Food is given out not to empty the pot, but to ensure the pot can be filled again tomorrow. When the final meal has been served, and the movement of people through the monastery begins to thin, the kitchen does not empty immediately, because the end of feeding is not the end of responsibility, and readiness for the next cycle begins before the current one has fully faded. The remaining heat of the hearth is assessed first, not visually, but by proximity, feeling how warmth radiates from stone and iron, determining which tasks can still be supported without rekindling the fire. Pots that will be reused are positioned deliberately near residual warmth, so moisture evaporates slowly, preventing stagnation without requiring additional fuel or attention. Liquids intended for reuse are cooled gradually, uncovered at first to release steam, then covered lightly once temperature stabilizes, reducing the risk of souring while preserving volume. Wooden tools are set out where air can reach all surfaces evenly, avoiding contact with damp stone that would encourage rot overnight. Metal implements are wiped and placed close enough to warmth to dry fully, but not so close that heat weakens joints or encourages warping. Surfaces are cleared methodically, not scrubbed to remove all trace of use, but returned to a neutral state where tomorrow's work will not be impeded by today's residue. The floor is swept along established paths, restoring predictability underfoot because early morning work often begins before full light returns. Water vessels are checked and refilled if needed, not for immediate use, but to ensure the morning fire is not delayed by unnecessary hauling when energy is still low. Fuel is arranged for the next day, smaller pieces placed within reach for ignition, larger logs stacked nearby, reducing decision-making when the day begins again. Nothing is reset to an idealized state because perfection requires effort that produces no functional benefit, and the kitchen values readiness over appearance. Items that were moved temporarily during the day are returned to their habitual positions, restoring the spatial memory that allows work to resume without conscious planning. This return to order happens gradually, interwoven with the final movements of the day, preventing fatigue from turning preparation into neglect. No checklist marks completion, because the system reveals readiness through absence of obstruction rather than presence of confirmation. By the time the kitchen is left unattended, it holds everything required to begin again: fuel prepared, vessels dry, paths clear, stores accessible. Nothing announces that the kitchen is finished for the night. It simply reaches a state where nothing more is required. The work does not end by stopping. It ends by being positioned carefully to continue. Once the kitchen has been returned to readiness, nothing further is required from it in an active sense, because all remaining processes have already been set in motion and will now proceed at their own pace without supervision, guided by heat slowly leaving stone, air moving through rooms, and materials settling into familiar states. The hearth no longer needs tending, because the remaining warmth has been distributed deliberately, stored in masonry, in iron, and in the bodies of vessels placed where cooling will occur evenly rather than abruptly. Ash continues to insulate what remains of the fire, reducing heat loss through convection, allowing embers to persist quietly beneath a thin layer that signals not activity, but potential, waiting without urgency for morning ignition. Water left in vessels reaches equilibrium with the room, no longer warm enough to steam, not yet cold enough to shock the hands, settling into a temperature that will not change significantly until daylight returns. Bread resting on boards continues to dry, crusts firming gradually as moisture migrates outward and escapes into the air, a process that requires no attention and benefits from being left undisturbed. Pottage reserved for reuse thickens slightly as starches complete their swelling, stabilizing texture overnight so that reheating will require less correction the following day. Nothing spoils immediately, because every element has been positioned within tolerable ranges of temperature, airflow, and exposure, ensuring that time passes slowly enough to remain manageable. The kitchen itself holds still, not in silence, but in low-level continuity. Stone releasing heat imperceptibly, wood equalizing humidity, metal cooling to ambient conditions without stress. No person is present to observe these changes, yet they occur exactly as expected because the system was designed to operate without constant oversight. This absence of supervision is not neglect, but confidence, built from long familiarity with how materials behave when allowed to do so. Nothing waits anxiously for morning, because nothing depends on sudden intervention, and this lack of dependency is what allows rest to exist at all. Outside the kitchen, night advances gradually, air cooling stone walls evenly, preventing condensation inside, maintaining the balance established earlier in the day. The storage rooms remain unchanged, airflow continuing through slatted shelves and vents, carrying away moisture at a rate slow enough to preserve contents without drying them excessively. Grain settles slightly within bins, surfaces leveling under their own weight, a familiar adjustment that requires no correction. Herbs suspended from beams sway almost imperceptibly as air shifts, drying evenly, protected from pests and damp through spacing rather than enclosure. Nothing is checked, nothing is counted, nothing is corrected. The system holds because it has been shaped to hold. Over many years, this pattern repeats without variation, significant enough to demand notice, because the absence of disruption is the measure of success here. Days do not end with closure, and nights do not interrupt function, because continuity has been prioritized over completion from the beginning. If someone were to enter the kitchen now, there would be no sign that work had recently ended, only the impression that work could begin immediately without rearrangement or explanation. Tools wait where they always wait. Paths remain clear where they always remain clear. Heat lingers where it has been taught to linger. The kitchen does not require memory, because it has replaced memory with placement, sequence, and habit that persist regardless of who notices them. Even time itself becomes less relevant here, because nothing depends on precise moments, only on readiness, which arrives naturally when conditions align. Morning will come, and when it does, the first actions will feel identical to countless mornings before, not because nothing has changed, but because change has been absorbed incrementally rather than allowed to accumulate. Fire will be lit where fuel already waits. Water will be carried from vessels already full. Work will begin without discussion. And if no one were watching, if no one were listening, the kitchen would still function exactly as intended, because its purpose was never performance, but continuation. Nothing here asks for attention now. Nothing here requires thought. The system is holding. The work is already ready, and it will remain so until it is needed again. By the time the monastery kitchen reaches the point where nothing more is required, there is no clear boundary separating work from non-work, because the final actions of the day are indistinguishable from preparation for the next, and the system has already shifted from doing into holding. No bell marks this transition, and no instruction confirms it, because everything that needed attention has already been placed where it will remain stable through the night, responding slowly to changes in temperature, air, and time without further interference. The hearth no longer draws the eye, not because it is cold, but because it has settled into a state where heat remains useful without being active, stone continuing to release warmth at a pace that does not demand fuel or correction. Water stands quietly in vessels whose placement ensures that freezing will not occur unless the weather itself makes it unavoidable, and even then, the containers are chosen to accommodate expansion without cracking. Bread rests where airflow remains constant, not drying too quickly, not trapping moisture, remaining in a state that preserves usefulness rather than freshness, because the goal has never been immediacy. Pots and tools are not arranged to look complete, but to behave predictably, their positions reflecting how they will be reached first thing in the morning, reducing effort before it is needed. The floor is clear not because it has been cleaned thoroughly, but because nothing remains that would alter movement when light is low and attention is still forming. No one walks through the kitchen now, yet it remains readable, its layout legible even in dim light, because order here has never relied on presence. Air continues to move through storage rooms and corridors, slowly exchanging moisture without carrying scent or cold too aggressively, preserving what remains without sealing it away. Nothing spoils suddenly. Nothing improves suddenly. Everything remains within acceptable limits. This balance is not fragile because it has been built to tolerate variation, expecting small shifts and absorbing them without adjustment. If the night is colder than expected, the system holds. If it is warmer, the system holds. If no one enters until late morning, the system holds. The kitchen does not anticipate tomorrow in detail, because detail would require memory, and memory is less reliable than structure. Instead, it waits in a state of readiness that does not depend on awareness, having already narrowed all possibilities into forms that can be handled calmly when the day resumes. This is how the kitchen survives not just one day, but years, remaining consistent across changes in personnel, seasons, harvests, and weather, because it has never been built around ideal conditions. What remains visible now is not the work itself, but the absence of tension, the absence of urgency, the absence of unfinished tasks demanding recall. Nothing asks to be remembered tonight. Nothing needs explanation tomorrow. When morning returns, the first actions will feel familiar, not because they are repeated exactly, but because the system ensures they cannot fail dramatically. Fire will be rebuilt where ash has been left thin. Water will be lifted from vessels already placed. Food will move from storage to heat without hesitation. The day will begin not with intention, but with motion that has already been prepared. And if someone listening now remains awake long enough to notice the quiet persistence of this arrangement, that awareness is incidental, because the kitchen does not require witnesses. It was never designed to impress, to teach, or to conclude. It was designed to continue. So the work recedes not into memory, but into position, into readiness, into a state where nothing further needs to be done for now. The system is holding, The day has thinned away, and the kitchen remains exactly where it needs to be.